Hi, everybody. We're on the last of our class session, session 311, about the great nonprofit. And here we're just going to talk about 4 different myths that are common when people think about the nonprofit sector, and then we'll talk about the corresponding truth. So, first, in this category of revenue, the myth is that great nonprofits engage in large public fundraising campaigns. That if you're a great nonprofit, you're raising lots of money from the public all the time. The truth is that great nonprofits diversify their revenue and they are resource driven, not dollar driven. And let me explain what I mean by these two things and the truth. A favorite moment I had once was when we took students to meet with the executive director of the Make-A-Wish Foundation in the greater Bay Area. We went into her office, and around her were all of these wishes that had been granted. I should say mementos from wishes that had been granted, photos of kids with famous players, signed basketballs, you name it. And she's got all these tokens of all these different wishes in her office on all these different shelves, and really cool memories of all the work that the organization had done. And then she said, and now I want to show you guys, she told my students, I want to show you the thing I'm most proud of. And she pulled out a pie chart. And the pie chart showed how during her time as executive director, they had diversified their fundraising activities to spread them out across a bunch of different things. So rather than just like having one big fundraising event every year or something like that, they were basically getting revenue from a lot of different places. And the thing that she was most proud of was the way they had diversified their revenue. That mattered because we were visiting them in 2010 after organizations had seen their nonprofit organizations had seen their revenue shrink quite a bit. And at a time when everybody else was shrinking, the Make-A-Wish Foundation in the greater Bay Area was staying even. And so it had everything to do with diversifying the revenue. And so it's important to not put all your eggs in one basket because you're going to risk a lot as a nonprofit if you do that. And then when I talk about nonprofits being resource driven, what I mean is this. It's easy just to focus on cash. Like it's easy to just think that my nonprofit does well if it has lots of cash. But cash isn't the only thing that you can do that has value to you. You can also have non-cash resources that are valuable to you. Let me give you some examples of what I mean here. It might be connections in the community, for example. That's not a cash-based thing, but that could produce a lot of value. It might be volunteers that are willing to show up to your door to do work for you that would be expensive to pay somebody to do on your behalf. The idea is that there are things that a nonprofit needs that are not reducible to cash, or if they had to pay for them with cash, they would be a lot more expensive. And so a good nonprofit leader is somebody who recognizes that a lot of their valuable resources come in the form of things other than cash, like relationships, like volunteers, like in-kind donations, or any sorts of these sorts of things. And so some principles or ideas that come from this. Success will attract resources, but not necessarily money to your organization. You might get volunteers who come to you because you're good at what you do, but not necessarily donors. So it's important to keep that in mind. Having too much cash could scare away other resources. If they think you're rich, they're not going to worry about volunteering for you, for example. And there are some ways where money is more expensive than just getting the resources directly. If you had to pay somebody to do something, you'd probably have to pay them a lot more than it's worth. Whereas if them giving you their volunteer time all of a sudden makes it a lot easier and cheaper to use. And so the best way to manage an organization is to think of both your non-cash resources and your cash resources working together. Non-cash resources are unique in the sense that you can't use them for other things. If a lawyer is doing pro bono work for my nonprofit, I can't then sell those pro bono hours to somebody else, for example. So they're neat, but they're cheap because I don't have to pay out for them. They're just given to us. Cash, on the other hand, is expensive in the sense that it's scarce and you have to when you're paying for things, it's expensive to pay for things, but cash obviously is flexible. So you can use cash in a lot of ways that these non-cash resources cannot be used. And so it's important to think about this, like what are all the resources I have at my disposal? What are the non-cash resources and how can I make the most of them? And then how can I use cash to meet our other needs is the way to operate. Okay, let's talk next about expenditures. The myth is that great nonprofits have very low overhead. This is an idea we visited many times this semester, so I'm just going to drive it home here. The truth is that great nonprofits focus on outcomes rather than overhead, and they treat their staff the way their staff want to be treated. Let me give you a list, an incomplete list of worthy overhead expenses. Training your employees doesn't count as a program expense, but it's worthwhile. Upgrading your equipment doesn't count as a program expense, but it's worthwhile. Having support staff and paying support staff is an overhead expense that's worth it. Paying people to measure your impact is not itself a program expense, which is one of the bitter ironies of the nonprofit sector. But you absolutely should be paying to measure impact or outcomes. And then having any sort of accounting practices or audits done, that's an overhead expense too, but absolutely necessary. So it's worth spending money on overhead expenses. The question you should be asking is, how will this help us do what we do better? You should always ask yourself that when you're spending money. How is this going to help us do what we do better? And how will we know? What is it that we're going to be able to do? How do we know that this is going to help us do what we do better? I'm going to show you guys this funny little reel in class about nonprofit managers and how they sometimes take advantage of their employees. But what the point I want to drive home here is that, employees of nonprofits deserve to like where they work, not just why they work. They deserve fair compensation and trustworthy bosses and valuable training, materials, support, power to make choices, friendly coworkers. Sometimes there's a culture in the nonprofit sector that if you're there because of a mission, a deep mission or purpose, that you don't deserve to be well treated. And I think it's horrible. And so we'll talk about this idea more in class too. Let's talk about a myth and then a truth related to organizational structure. The myth is that great nonprofits are driven by charismatic founders. This is actually a red flag, in my opinion. The truth is that great nonprofits have active, strategy-focused boards of directors, and they have accountable executives. There's a model for nonprofit governance that is messed up and that makes nonprofits act pretty poorly, and it's when you have a sort of meddlesome board that's not letting the staff run things the way it ought to be run, or it's a lazy board that's not involved enough. The meddlesome board looks like this, where each individual director of the nonprofit feels like they're a boss, and each one sort of shows up and tells the executive director what to do, or even tells staff directly what to do. This is a broken relationship, and there's a guy named John Carver who wrote a book about this very problem called Boards That Make a Difference. The way it ought to work is instead the following way. There's a line, a division line between the responsibilities of a board and the staff, like the executive director and staff. The board should be focused on strategy, and the executive director should be focused on administration. And there may be times that as a director, you go over to the administrative side, like you're going to help out with a fundraising event. But if you do, you're not a boss. If you're a director, you are now an employee or volunteer being guided by the executive director. And then when you're done doing that, you go back to being a director and with the other directors making decisions. Also notice that instead of individual lines, we just have one line connecting this, because the truth is that a member of a board of directors has no legal authority by themselves. It's only when they act collectively as a board of directors that there's any legal authority. So they speak with one voice, even if they disagree, and so they vote, and it's a split vote about what to do. The point is the winning vote is what decides how the organization is going to be directed or managed. Bill Holterstumber runs the United Way of Utah County, likes to say that if the board of directors ever wants to dip into the administrative stuff, then they have to own everything. And the example he uses is that if like a nonprofit is renovating its office and the board has an opinion, a strong opinion about what color the carpet should be, well, they can have that opinion, but if they're going to do that, they're in charge of sourcing the carpet, getting it installed, paying for it, and everything else. And if as a board you don't want to do that, then you don't get to decide what color the carpet is, unless it has strategic importance. Let me give you examples of where where the dividing line exists between strategy and administration. In operations, the board is going to decide what core programs, where the office is, what the executive staff are for a nonprofit. But the executive director and staff, they worry about non-executive staff and day-to-day activities. On the finances side, the board should be in charge of executive director compensation, their audits, approving budgets, but it's the staff that generates those budgets and proposes them, that does the bookkeeping, that manages all the contracts and payments. The board will be in charge of a strategic plan of the overall governance of the organization. The staff will be in charge of managing the website or keeping track of all of its important documents. This is an important difference because it's putting the proper entities in charge of the proper responsibilities. Basically, if I were to summarize this, the strategy, what the board's in charge of are the ends or the goals, and the staff are in charge of the means in terms of how they get there. Let me give you an example of a lazy board of directors, though. And here I've got an executive committee, like a part of the board. And what often happens in nonprofits is the agenda for that meeting has been set by the executive director. So the executive director shows up with the agenda and says, okay, board or committee, here's everything we're going to talk about. But this is wrong. And John Carver says that we should have that board's meetings are by the board, not just management meetings for the board. And it should be the board that's in charge of the agenda and not the executive director. Now, you might ask the executive director what should be on the agenda. Of course, you would do that. But the board should be determining the agenda, not the executive director. All right, let's talk last about governance. And the myth is that great nonprofits are just entirely trustworthy. The truth is that great nonprofits operate in a way as to be above reproach. What I mean by above reproach is they operate with transparency so that people have reasons to trust them. They engage in best practices that indicate that their work is trustworthy. They don't just ask for or instill trust. They operate in a way that demands trust because the way that they're operating just is so obviously correct that you don't have a reason to not trust them, rather than just hoping that they're doing a good job, or they're giving you promises that they're doing a good job. You have objective ways to observe that they're doing a good job. And this is how great nonprofits operate, is by operating above reproach. And they do it by the things on this list and things we'll talk about in class. And that's it. I hope you've enjoyed not just this class session, but the semester. And I'll look forward to seeing you all in our last class.